Hey Flock, Mike here from Epic Duck Studios, and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be painting Black Panther from Marvel Crisis Protocol. To begin, I'm just going to lay down a solid coat of Badger Stynylrez in black. This is a brush-on or airbrushable primer, and it's going to help form a base coat, or at least get us close to one. I don't like to rely on primer as a source of color, but it does help to, guide your colors in the right direction. It doesn't make sense to use a light primer for dark paint and vice versa, so here's some black. Now, obviously Black Panther is going to be something at least similar to black, maybe not purely black, but the base is going to end up a little bit more of a gray, but because I've already got the black primer out, I'm going to go ahead and just hit the base with it anyway. So to get Black Panther started, I'm going to begin with an all-over base coat of Ashith Gray. Ashith Gray is a P3 color, which is just a slightly purple tinted dark gray, and this will form a really good color to build Black Panther from, which doesn't start from a pure black, because when you start from a pure black, you've got nowhere else to go. You can't go darker. And with comic style, I like to really include black lining as part of my process, and you can't black line over black. It just doesn't work. The great thing about Black Panther is that even though he's a very dynamic character, his costume is incredibly simple. It's basically one thing head to toe with a couple little accents on it, so you can get the colors down very quickly. With the Ashith Gray base coat down, I'm going to switch over to some Citadel Xeris Purple, and I'm going to use this as my sort of broad highlight color. This is going to cover roughly half the model, leaving the other half as Ashith Gray. And you'll see that, I basically bring this towards all these sort of upper facing surfaces of the model, so that everything, underneath it, the bottom of the legs, the bottom of the arms, places like that, they'll stay Ashith Gray, and they might pick up a little bit of black later on. Whereas everything facing up and towards the viewer, whether it's an upper surface or kind of just facing outward from the model, will get a pretty healthy dose of purple here. In fact, you'll notice as I paint that I'm really only looking at the model from above, or from at most about a 3/4 angle. I'm never at this point looking at it from below to see if I've missed anything, because the parts you can see below, I don't want to get with the purple. I want them to be missed. So I'm just continuing to work my way around Black Panther and using the purple to really just define his musculature more than anything. Using it to follow the curves and the shapes of his muscle, of, the bulges in his suit, and then certain little crests and so on his head. Now, to make another highlight from that, I'm going to mix a little bit of P3 Mora White into the Xeris Purple. Now, as you add white into purple paint, it starts to really desaturate quite quickly, and you're going to start to notice your tones have a real sort of lilac feel to them. Honestly, that's going to work just fine with this character, but in general, that might not be what you want from purple paint. And if that's the case, what you need to do is work in little bits of magenta instead of white, or in addition to the white, which will push it into a little bit more of like a pink range, but often that's visually preferable to, the really light pastel kind of purples that you get from adding white in. Now, Black Panther's costume has some detailing, looks sort of like anklets or bracelets around the ankles, the wrists, and near the elbow, and originally I start by painting these with just a purple highlight. But later on, I decided to use those as an excuse to bring in a splash of extra color and tie those back to the gold necklace that he's wearing. So right here, you'll see me add some highlights to them, and ultimately that just ends up being wasted effort because I decided to do something different later on. Now, because Black Panther is such a dark looking character, and I don't really have the opportunity to bring in a lot of black lining because there's just no bright colors to line against, I'm putting my highlights in sort of a line-ish fashion, and it'll basically help give the same appearance of hatch marks that my other Crisis Protocol characters have, but without having to do it with black ink, because just contrast between black and dark grays and dark purples just doesn't really allow for it. But what you'll see here is most of these highlights, rather than doing them as a kind of bulkier spot highlight, I'm doing them as a series of small parallel lines, and that gives the kind of sketchy inked effect that I want without actually diving into using black ink. Now when I'm highlighting the face here, there is actually a little bit of linear detail added into the face. It's kind of something similar to like a letter V coming in across the forehead that's a little bit wider at the top. And it's not super obvious, it's a pretty low impact detail on the model. You could be forgiven if you didn't notice it at all, but since I know it's there, I'm doing my best to, bring that detail out and give it a little bit of attention. Once the purples are all done, I'm going to start laying down a base coat for the gold details using P3 Mediocre. The most prominent of these gold details is the necklace, but like I said, I'm going to go into the wrist, ankle, and elbow details as well. And he also has a belt in place, and we'll use it there too. Now, Mediocre is a really great color, but it doesn't give perfect one-coat coverage. If you're looking to paint things a little bit faster, I would look at Citadel Averland Sunset as a comparable alternative, but I like the color of Mediocre just a little bit better. So here I'm picking out that detail that kind of wraps around near the elbow, and it's got a little bit of a panther tooth motif to it as well. There's a couple little spikes that kind of come out of it and face down the arm. So you want to be mindful of those and just pick them out, as well as the simple band around the wrist. Can't forget about the belt, it's a really obvious detail. Now one of the less obvious details I'm going to pick out with the Mediocre is the chevron style banding around each of the ankles. We're getting to the point where there's almost like a critical mass of gold, and it really is obvious as a secondary color on the model now, whereas before it was just a little bit of an accent. It's now almost as dominant visually as the purple is. Now I'm going to start building that from a flat brown into a non-metallic metal gold, and I'm going to begin by using Warcolor's One Coat Yellow. Now non-metallic metal in comic style is really more about creating shapes as opposed to, really truly representing reflections. What I'm doing is a lot of sort of a combination of edge highlighting and just creating these contrasting areas of the darker color, the mediocre, and this bright yellow. And you can see the bright yellow often follows very linear shapes. It's either basically little straight lines, or it ends up looking like either the letter Z or the letter H kind of tilted on its side. Especially on larger surfaces like the belt, where we want a line across the top and line across the bottom, then you want a little shiny spot to connect them. In comics, you don't have access to true metallics to make things look shiny, so the way to handle making things shiny is just actually playing more with the shadow than anything else, and really just juxtaposing shadows against highlights in a very, very contrast-heavy, dynamic way. When you go back to earlier comics, metals were represented entirely in black and white, and very effectively. You'd look at an old Iron Man suit or something in a black and white comic, and you could still tell it was meant to be metal. It had a very unique feel compared to other textures that the artist had created. It really helps that because this is Black Panther, we know he's going to be wearing some form of gold ornate trim, and so we're seeing what we expect to see. It's really one of the cool things about painting Crisis Protocol characters is you can play into the viewer's expectation of what the model's supposed to look like. So now I've gone ahead and I've grabbed a little bit of pure white. This was already on the palette from highlighting the purple. And I'm just adding a little glint of that to the points on the necklace, and then just kind of building highlights on top of the bright yellow in a few other places. So you can see it really doesn't take much to get this to visually represent gold. It starts to feel like a shiny metallic very, very quickly with only 3 colors. We're not really building a lot up here. What makes it feel more metallic than anything else on the model, for example his costume, what makes it feel different is the super bright highlights give the impression that it is a very, very reflective surface, whereas we've got much more toned down highlights on the costume. And so it's a visual cue that all these gold elements are made of a different material. Now with the gold highlights done, I decided I wanted to make the shadows on the gold a little bit deeper, so I'm going to use some P3 Blood Tracker Brown and just add this into the areas I haven't highlighted and just work it up into the mediocre. I'm basically painting in a shadow on all the gold details, except that in some places, like, you know, the small of his back, the shadow doesn't exactly make sense, but it's just a counterpoint to the highlights we have. You know, one thing that's very true in comics is that the highlights and reflections in metals often don't emulate the real world. They're just meant to imply a texture and not have any true bearing on what light sources or what shadows might be nearby, and we can work with that. Now at this point Black Panther is basically done. I want to bring a little bit of comic style black lining in, specifically around the gold details and just a few important shadows on his costume. But before I do that, I'm going to start detailing the base, because the base is honestly where I'm going to get the most value out of black lining here. You know, there's a lot of little crevices and cracks and just sharp angles happening, especially on this little rock he's standing on. And those are all going to really take well to black lining. Black Panther himself actually doesn't have a lot of opportunity for it because his costume's already so dark. The only place we're going to really see a lot of value from black lining him is going to be kind of isolating some of the elements of the gold and just making some deeper shadows on some parts of his costume, but they're not going to really stand out the way they do on, say, Captain America or Spider-Man. Now I'm going to do a little bit of inking on the base before I get the detailing down, and that's just going to be this area along that sort of inner lip of the base, kind of separating, you know, that detailed topper from the outer rim. And that's simply because I've already got my base color available, and this is one of the areas where I tend to make just tiny little mistakes because it requires a pretty consistent line width around a circle, and there's a bit of a challenge in, you know, maintaining that. So because I know I'm probably going to have to do a little bit of touch-up work around this black line, I might as well just do this black line first before, you know, I'm really, really far into detailing. So it just minimizes the chance I'm going to mess something up. Now I've mixed a little bit of white into the Mechanicus Standard Gray, and I'm using that to just bring out the edges, the sort of outer planes of this, you know, pile of rubble that Black Panther's on, as well as parts of the concrete below. So you can see these highlights are being done in pretty broad, wide strokes. They almost cover the entire surface of some of these pieces of rubble, but they leave a little bit of the darker gray just kind of showing towards the center of the model. So I'm kind of just building almost like a radial highlight. It, you know, works around towards the edge of the base. Now I've gone ahead and mixed a little bit more white into that, and I'm just going to create more of a true edge highlight on those same areas. Just, you know, pulling out corners and sharp edges and just making them stand off each other a little bit nicer. So you can see I'm being kind of fast and loose with these highlights. They're not following the entire edge all the way around. They kind of just fade in and out a little bit. And this really kind of just helps create the illusion of it sort of being like a comic book background, where it's not fully painted. You know, it's got a little less care than the character does. Alright, and now it's time for the thing that makes comic style, and that is, of course, the black ink. Today I'm using Higgins Black Magic. It's a waterproof artist ink you can get from most fine art stores. If you can't find it, other inks work really well, such as Daler Rowney FW, Liquitex Carbon Black, or Amsterdam Black ink. I like using black ink as opposed to black paint because it has a much nicer flow characteristic. And what I mean by that is it just comes off the brush nicer, it doesn't clog the brush up the same way as paint does, and it's also, in general, a much truer black. So on the base here, what I'm doing is I'm filling in the creases or the crevices, the cracks in the pavement, and then outlining this piece of rubble that Black Panther is standing on. We also see I'm bringing the lines, you know, where there's sort of like creases in the side of the rubble, I'm bringing the line up to the top. And this just helps create a little bit of dimensionality and creates some sort of like focal lines that draw you up into the model a little bit better. One other thing that's really important to do is outline around the model's feet, and what that does is it helps isolate the model from the base. You want a distinct kind of break between the model and the basing material, and the black line really helps do that. Now I'm also using the black to add some sort of fill shadows, in this case on the heel of his foot. Now the concrete also has a few little dings and dents, and what I'm doing is roughly outlining those, not fully enclosing them, but doing about a 3/4 circle around them. The next thing to do on the base here is just grab some of the sharp edges of especially the larger pieces of concrete here, and just make sure those edges have a prominent black line. I've made it a little bit thinner than some of the deeper lines on the base, but it's enough that you can, very clearly see sort of the faces or the different surfaces of that chunk of concrete. So now I'm going to bring a little bit of black lining up onto Black Panther himself, and this is going to be pretty minimal because his costume's already fairly dark. What I'm doing is creating lines between the gold details and the black costume, or the dark purple costume, and then adding just a few volume shadows to different areas of the costume as well. Now, because almost all of the sort of jewelry details here are basically made of like adjacent rings or adjacent linear details, lining them can take a little while, and you can be totally forgiven for just outlining them and not trying to hit those lines in between. I do put the effort in here, and especially around the little claw details, making sure they have a tiny little hit at that angle that they kind of come off the main surface, just to make them appear as a little bit of a distinct detail. It really adds a lot of pop to them. That little hit of black just makes them stand out so much more than they do already, that I think it's really worth the effort, but I can also understand why someone might not want to. So now that we're getting a certain amount of black ink on the model, you can actually see how much lighter Ashith Gray is, that base coat that's underneath his costume, compared to the black. And this informs us that there's room here for some black shading on the costume itself. If I brought a little bit of black ink in here and there, it's going to be noticeable. It's going to be subtle compared to, doing black lining on brighter, more primary color-based characters like Spider-Man or Captain America, but it's still got some room for it. And so here we go, I'm adding some volume shadows now. And this is basically areas where there's not going to be a lot of direct light, and we also want to profile the model against itself. And what I mean by that is, in an action pose like this, where he's kind of doing the superhero landing thing, when you view this model from the side, I want the black inner surface of that right leg making the left leg much more dominant visually. And you can see this also is a good opportunity to kind of shape some of the muscle. You can kind of, I'm using some curvature here to make the back of his thigh and his buttock just a little more prominent, give them a little more definition, make them look less flat. And now I'm also bringing a line underneath the thigh, and what that does is it creates what's called like a profile line or a profile shadow. And what happens is when you view the model from the side, it looks like the line is drawn in place because there's effectively an underline on the leg when viewed from certain angles. And it just makes the leg kind of look more drawn in place. It lends to that comic feel. Now, because of his pose, Black Panther doesn't have a lot of opportunity for these large volume shadows. They're pretty much just under the legs and under the arms, and that's really about it. The rest of his pose is very sort of big and wide open. Arguably, his chest is kind of facing a bit of a downward angle, but not by much. He's actually kind of from the waist up fairly upright, and we also don't want to shade away details like that necklace around his neck. Like, that's a very prominent, important detail to the character, and one of the things that happens in comics is that important details get to ignore physics. The way to think of that is like Batman's eyes are always going to be white. I'm thinking of Batman the Animated Series, by the way. They're going to show up white even in a pitch black setting, and that's the kind of thing we can take from comic style, is that lighting doesn't necessarily have to impact the way your model looks. Now, speaking of Batman's pure white eyes, we're basically going to do the exact same thing here. I'm bringing a little bit of just pure white, P3 Moro white, and just painting the eyes with that. And then what I'll do is bring in some black ink again to help shape and frame the eye so that the white is just even more contrasted and standoffish from the rest of the costume. The black line around the eye can also be used to sort of add weight and shape to it. It lets you control the actual expression a little bit more than the white paint on its own does. And you can really kind of, tighten it down into like a grimace or a growl, or leave them a little bit wider and more surprised looking. And the black just really makes that easy. Now at this point, Black Panther is basically done. The only thing I want to do now is just clean up that base rim. I'm going to bring in the same blue I used for most of my other good guy miniatures in Marvel Crisis Protocol. This is basically the color I use for my Avengers affiliation. Now, Black Panther has two different affiliations. He's part of both the Avengers and the Wakanda affiliations. And because of that, this base rim color doesn't necessarily make sense for him the way I paint my minis. But I'm going ahead with it. The very, very last thing to do here now is just clean up a little bit of the gray around the base rim, just adding a little bit of that black ink back in. And there it is. My Black Panther is ready for the table in his kind of MCU-inspired purple and gold. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.
Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed that one, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you get notifications when I post new videos in the future. If you want to take your support even further, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Every little bit helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing, puts new models on the table so I can make interesting videos, and most importantly, puts a roof over my family's head and food on the table. You can also join me for live painting shows several times a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios. I'd love if you came by and watched the show sometime and followed the channel. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's supported my content over the years, both past and present. It's been an absolutely wild ride, and I couldn't do this without all the wonderful fans and flockers out there. The hobby community is just an amazing group of people, and you really make this worth doing. So let's just keep on doing this together, making more content, and just being fantastic together for years to come. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.